The Lost Metal. It's finally out, folks. It's actually been out for a while now. Book 4 of Mistborn Era 2, Book 7 of Mistborn, Book 14 of the Cosmere. I've been really excited about this book for a long time, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have as well. Since the book has already been out for a couple of weeks at the time that I'm filming this, I'm going to go ahead and do a full spoiler talk. So if you have not read the book or any of the other Mistborn books, now would be the chance to look away. I am not going to be spoiling other Cosmere books though, so you can be rest assured on that. There was a lot of stuff I really liked about this book. There was a lot of stuff to like. Sometimes to the book's own detriment, because there was a little bit too much stuff to like, but I'll get into that later. I've heard other reviewers saying that of the 3 main plot lines, some of them are less interesting or less well developed, and honestly, I didn't get that. I really enjoyed all 3 of the main plot lines in this book. The Wax and Wayne plotline, the Marzi and the Ghostbloods plotline, and the Steros plotline. Obviously, the Ghostbloods plotline is of special interest to a lot of diehard Cosmere fans, but I really thought all 3 plotlines were consistently engaging, and none of them ever slowed the pacing of the story down. Even the Steros plotline, which I've particularly seen some people criticizing, I really enjoyed that plotline. You know, Steros is one of my favorite characters, period, in the Cosmere, and it's so nice to see her finally getting a real chance to be in the spotlight. I especially like how this whole plotline is centered around helping the ordinary people of Elendel. I always like it when books don't forget about ordinary people in the middle of all this big epic fantasy stuff. And so I liked the practicality of that plotline of trying to evacuate the city because of this bomb threat. I liked seeing Steros in action and finally getting recognized for her talents and putting them to I mean, she's always put them to useful ends, but putting them to especially useful ends this time around. I've also seen people criticize this plotline, saying that the entire plotline just exists to justify this one scene where the Malwish get the Bands of Mourning back and take them back to their own country. But I really don't think that was the case. I think that's going to be important for Era 3, but I don't think the entire plotline was there just to justify that. The Wax and Wayne plotline was consistently really fun, and I really think it's fitting with this being the last book in the Wax and Wayne series that those 2 characters are paired together for most of the book. As always, there were some pretty epic fight scenes, some good cocky lines from Wayne. It was just a lot of fun all around. And then, of course, there's the Ghostbloods. So a few weeks before this book came out, I made a video on my channel about Taldane and autonomy. My theory in that video was basically that people on Taldane are aware of autonomy in a way that most people on most shard worlds are not aware of their shards, and that autonomy is sort of like a dictator that helps boost her planet's technological progress, and that she's using the technological advantages that her planet has for some sort of nefarious purpose. And I was not expecting that video to be relevant at all to this Mistborn book, but it was. This book basically confirms that theory. We finally get some information about autonomy and her intentions, and I really love the characterization of autonomy and her intent depicted through the kind of like brutalist architecture of Bilming. I thought that was really cool to see like that trans-planetary influence affecting Scadrial. The idea of striving for independence and trying to prove yourself, all while simultaneously being subservient to this divine being, is really interesting and reminds me somewhat of the ideology of objectivism, like this idea that the only way to ensure communal good is to all like strive independently from one another and work for our own selfishness. You know, if you've ever played BioShock, it's like the main ideology that drives the plotline in that game. And I also like how in this Ghostbloods plotline, we get to not only see characters that we're familiar with from other Cosmere books, including Shai from The Emperor's Soul. That's not a spoiler for The Emperor's Soul, because we don't actually know how she ended up getting to Scadrial. That book doesn't explain that. It's basically a completely separate story, but it is the same character. But we also get to see characters from worlds that we've never encountered before, including Twin Soul from the world of the Ethers. It's really interesting that this is our first introduction, our first proper introduction at least, to Ethers in the Cosmere. I'm excited to see more of this world in the future, but I'm also I'm really glad that world-hopping characters are being introduced in this way, where we don't know anything about them, just like the characters on Scadrial wouldn't know anything about them. I think this is sort of Sanderson's way of responding to criticisms that you have to have read the entire Cosmere to understand these stories, when in fact, no, you can read this book without having read any of the other Cosmere books, and in that case you'll just be experiencing these world hoppers and this story in the way that Marzi is. Reading this book also reminded me of one of my favorite things about Brandon Sanderson books in general, which is that characters don't rush blindly into situations. They actually take time to prepare and, you know, have common sense and are smart about the way they approach danger. A perfect example of this is the scene near the beginning of the book when they're first experimenting with harmonium, and Steris, you know, being Steris of course, takes all these precautions to make sure that they aren't in danger when they're splitting the harmonium with the Trellium. They put the reaction in a small safe and then go upstairs and wear masks when coming downstairs, and they're careful not to inhale any particulates that might be in the air or step on any glass. You know, if this was like a Hollywood movie, they wouldn't do any of that, because you don't see characters doing stuff like that in movies. They would have just like sliced the harmonium with the Trellium and then been caught in a massive explosion and somehow survived that. So it's really refreshing to be reading a book where characters do the sort of nitty-gritty menial tasks to ensure their own safety that you would expect actual human beings to do. It's just something I appreciate, not just in this book, but in pretty much all of Brandon Sanderson's books. So there were some things I didn't like as well. I'll start with some minor things. First of all, one very small thing that kind of gets on my nerves is Alec, and specifically his relationship with Marzi. I'm just not buying it at all. Like, Alec's only personality trait that we know of is that he likes to make pastries, which is like, that's not really enough for a character to be the love interest of one of the main characters, you know? And because of the 6-year time gap between this book and the previous book, basically all of the so-called romance between Marzi and Alec happened off-screen, to the extent that I just don't believe it. Like in the first scene in this book where Marzi and Alec interact with each other, I thought there's no way that the small like flirtation they had in the last book actually went anywhere, because they just didn't act like they were in love with each other. But no, turns out they've actually been dating for 2 years. I just feel like Marzi, you know, being one of my favorite characters in this era of Mistborn, should have gotten a more fleshed out love interest, or just shouldn't have had one at all. It just feels like a weird thing that's kind of like shoved into this book, because it feels like a Wheel of Time romance, basically. In the Wheel of Time, characters just kind of fall in love with each other, not because of any mutual attraction, but just because fate, or they happen to be in the same room with each other for one scene or something like that. And that's what this felt like, at least to me. I don't know, feel free to disagree with me. I'm sure there are a lot of Alec fans out there, but he doesn't have enough in this book to justify being Marzi's love interest. Another minor thing that bothered me from a plot perspective was the whole thing with the rocket. From the very beginning, I just wasn't buying it. Like, the people of the Ellendale Basin have not even invented planes yet. And Wax, when he learns that the set is trying to build a rocket to launch basically the equivalent of a nuclear weapon at Ellendale, I don't understand why he would believe that. I didn't believe it for 1 second, and sure enough, it turned out to be a hoax, and the real threat was the warships, which is what I suspected from the very beginning. And that's not a common thing in a Brandon Sanderson book, where I can see a plot twist coming from the very beginning. But in this book, like, Billming's whole thing is that they have these massive warships. Like, it's very heavily emphasized from the beginning of this book, and even in previous books it's mentioned that they have these warships. So I don't understand why that wouldn't be Wax's first thought when it comes to how the set was planning to deliver a bomb. But instead, we spend the majority of this book chasing after a rocket that doesn't turn out to function at all. And so that kind of leads me into some of the broader criticisms I have of this book, which is that there are just too many things going on. I get that this book is set at a period in Scadrial's history, which is kind of like a transition point. where there are major technological changes happening, and everything is sort of in flux, and the whole fate of the world is hanging in the balance. But the thing is, the stakes in this book escalate so quickly that it doesn't really feel justified given the tone of the other books in this era. And even with the 6-year time gap, so many of the things in this book are just a little bit unbelievable. Like the massive skyscraper at the center of Bilming, which is so tall that Wax can't even get like halfway up with one of his coin pushes. And this entire community of people living in an underground village who have been convinced by a colorized motion picture that the world outside has fallen into ruin. It's not that any of these ideas are so implausible that they would ruin the book on their own, but there's just so many of these things, and most of them are not given very much page time, which means that a lot of it gets brushed under the rug. Like, I would have loved to learn more about the community and about the people living down there and what the effects of living underground for 6 years on their psyche are, but we get very little of that. We don't even get any POVs from the perspective of one of these people. You could write an entire book just about this underground community and the way they've been lied to their entire lives and the existential crisis they go through as a result of learning that they've been lied to. But instead, it's sort of just smacked onto the last 100 pages of this book, and I would have liked a little bit more. This book is sort of caught in a limbo between being epic fantasy and being pulp fiction. Like, the stakes are incredibly high, much higher than anything we've seen in Era 2 so far, but at the same time, it still has to feel very pulpy and sort of like it feels sort of like a James Bond movie, you know, with the whole city-destroying bomb plotline. And being caught in that limbo, I think, was a little bit to the book's detriment. The whole thing just feels a little weird and less than the sum of its parts. And then there's the ending of this book, which conceptually, I quite like this ending, and I really like that we get so many epilogues from the perspective of all the main characters, and that we get solid conclusions to all of their storylines. But the way it was written down, I'm not a huge fan of it. It feels a little bit like for the main characters, everything was wrapped up a little bit too neatly. Even after Wayne's death, which was very well done, I think, even though I did see it coming from the very beginning of this book, basically. Like, his death was almost written in stone from the prologue. But even after his death, it feels a little bit like the main characters go back to their lives a little bit too easily. Like with the Marazi epilogue, she finds out that Wayne died and is very upset for like a page, but then we kind of go immediately back to the Ghostblood stuff because it's the end of the book and we have to wrap that up. And with Wax and Steris, you know, we get a lot of grief from Wax. But when we flash forward 2 years later for the very last epilogue, it feels almost like nothing has happened in the intervening time. It's just that Wax and Steris have been happily married this entire time, and now Wax is retired and not really worrying about anything, and Steris is kind of happily managing emergency situations in the city. And I don't really feel the impact of all of the events of this book. If I had to put it into words, I'd say that the ending of this book is trying to make you think that things are more resolved than they actually are. Because the main characters in this book basically find out that aliens exist. Marazi finds out about the Ghostbloods and this whole world-hopping organization, but even Wax, and presumably Steris as well, find out about autonomy and the fact that there are these other gods in the Cosmere who are trying to influence their planet and take over their planet. I feel like that sort of revelation would have a major impact on their lives that I'm not really seeing. We don't really know what happens with Marazi's relationship with the Ghostbloods. We don't really get to see the outcome of her realization that the most effective way to help people might be to become a world hopper or to become more Cosmere aware. It's sort of just like she saves the world and then goes back to doing ordinary politicking stuff. Even if I think it was probably the right decision not to have Marazi join the Ghostbloods, I feel like she would want to learn more about the broader Cosmere, and I feel like nothing in her life would ever really be the same after this, and the same goes with Wax and Steris. And I don't know, it feels a little bit like Sanderson is trying to force a happy ending when in reality we as the reader know that there's all this broader Cosmere stuff going on and really nothing is resolved, and there's all this Era 3 conflict getting set up between Kelsier and Sazed. And I don't know, maybe that's just the way the Cosmere is going to be from now on because of how interconnected it is. But in a way, I think that that would be kind of a shame because I really liked the definitive conclusion we got to the first era of Mistborn. I liked how that ending felt like it could have been the ending of everything and you didn't have to read anymore to get the broader story. I don't really want the Cosmere to become like an MCU sort of thing where every book is just kind of like a teaser for the next book. And I don't think it will. But this book had some elements of it where it's like, okay, this feels sort of like a teaser for Era 3 more than I would want it to be. I feel like this review is getting a little long, so I'm gonna try to wrap up here. But basically, I had some mixed feelings about this book. On the one hand, it does consist of everything that makes Brandon Sanderson great and more. It was consistently gripping the entire way through, and it had the great character interactions and the cool Cosmere connections and the magic systems and everything. But at the same time, even though I was enthralled the whole way through, when I finally put the book down, I didn't get the same feeling of satisfaction that I would have wanted to have. It didn't really feel like Era 2 had finished. It just sort of felt like it stopped. I think it is kind of clear that Brandon Sanderson's original plan for Era 2 was not to go this Cosmere aware early on. I remember him saying previously that we were going to have to wait until Era 3 to find out who or what Trail actually was. And clearly he changed that, along with adding in a ton of other Cosmere stuff. And as a result, there's just sort of a tonal mismatch between this book and the previous Era 2 books. Maybe it's just inevitable because of how long Era 2 took to write. Book 1, The Alloy of Law, came out in 2011, and this is 11 years later. And now we're at a much different point in the Cosmere, so we kind of have to acknowledge the broader stuff going on. But at the same time, it sort of feels like this book is a rare example of Brandon Sanderson not plotting things out completely, or at the very least changing his original outline so much that it's a little bit jarring for the reader. So yeah, those are my general thoughts on The Lost Metal. Some people have been asking me if I'm going to do a recap of The Lost Metal similar to how I did for the previous Era 2 books. And I don't know, I probably will, but it might not be for a little while. Because I also want to do like non-Mistborn related content. Anyway, thanks so much for watching, and let me know what you thought of this book in the comments. If you totally disagree with me, I don't know. I feel like this book is going to be a somewhat controversial one among the fandom, and I'm excited to see what other people have to say about it. Drop a like and subscribe and all of that good stuff, and see you next time around.